Sure. Well, I guess I'm a recovering financial services professional. Spent over 20 years working for various SEC FINRA regulated broker dealers, and including time as CEO of three different firms. I have an MBA from Duke University, and I'm also a fiction writer. I've written a book called Quaz, a financial thriller that deals with corrupt central bankers and so on. And as part of that research and what I basically learned throughout my career in the industry was just how deep these tentacles go, whether we're talking about the central banks, the World Bank, the IMF, the BlackRocks of the world, and where all the strings are really being pulled and what's going on. And so that's really what I like to talk about and try to spread the word on whenever I can. Yeah, so he came out and he did 50 basis points, 0.5%, which the market was not sure about. And typically, Powell and the Fed, they like to telegraph exactly what they're going to do to the market. But some people were surprised, and I think the reason they were surprised was the economy, although there are huge issues, especially for the average American, overall in the aggregate, GDP, things of that nature are not that bad. And so when he came out and he did 50, some people scratched their heads. I was not that surprised because I think what's really behind that move, it's not so much to stimulate the economy as much as it is a concern about the net interest cost, the borrowing cost that the U.S. government is paying. So, today, as we record on September 30, this is the end of the fiscal year, right? So the government is for this year going to have spent more money on interest than any other outlay except for Social Security. It's going to be in that $1 trillion ballpark when they released the figures a couple of weeks ago, and we know exactly what it is. But basically, interest rates needed to come down both for the government's borrowing costs as well as for commercial real estate loans that may have been taken out 5 years ago that are now going to need to be refinanced. And this is the same case all around the world, in the UK, in the ECB, and even in China. And that's what's been really interesting in the last week. And this is part of the way these central bankers coordinate their actions. I don't think it's a coincidence that just last week, the Chinese central bank, the People's Bank of China, came out and announced massive stimulus, lowered interest rates, said they were going to set up a huge fund to essentially buy Chinese stocks, to buy equities, to support the equity market. And so what we're having is a concerted effort by all the major world central banks to systematically devalue their currencies together. And that's where you get a situation like we have now, where when you compare the dollar to the yen or to the euro, it looks like it's doing okay. But when you compare it to gold, it's down 30% this year. And the stock market's up in dollar terms, but it's down in gold terms. And so what we're seeing is the continuing debasement of the currency, coordinated central bank action globally to debase all major currencies. And that's why we're seeing gold hit new highs over 2,600 an ounce. And that's the general picture that I see as related to Powell and his recent move. Well, one thing that they don't like is they just don't like getting paid in dollars when they're going down. And this was really, we talked about this, I think, last time, that this was behind a lot of what happened in the 1970s. And a lot of people were looking at Middle East political tensions as reasons for the oil embargoes. But a lot of it had to do with the removal of the gold backing of the dollar, because Saudi Arabia was one of the few countries that actually would demand that the United States basically cash in their dollars for gold. And we used to send plane loads of bullion over to Saudi Arabia on a regular basis in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so when we came off of that, they basically fought back. And I think we're seeing them try to fight back now as these currencies continue to be debased, because they have to store that money. And what they've been doing for a long time is, instead of holding all their money in treasury bills, they're holding a lot more in gold. And they're also trying, as is China and other countries that typically had held a lot of our treasury debt, they're holding gold, but they're also doing resource grabs. They're buying mineral resources in the developing world. They're buying land right here in the United States. They're trying to grab all the things that you can't print, and that are going to be worth something, and that are economic necessities. And that's what they're grabbing. And you're seeing it done on corporate levels as well, with BlackRock, which you know well, where they have all of these farmland deals. They also just announced I believe it was a $30 or $50 billion fund just for AI investments.
Right, I saw that.
And the thing with AI, it's not just the energy and the water that needs, but then you look at their push for EV, also energy drag. And then when you look at the crypto space, the amount of energy required to mine things like Bitcoin and some of these other coins and tokens is immense. So you have these three huge drains on our electric grid, which is falling apart. And they're just adding more and more to it. And they're going to be the ones building the data centers. Amazon's buying a nuclear power plant. They're taking over this critical infrastructure. So then they can basically keep us as sardines, in the cities and not drive anywhere. And so it's all part of that plan, that 2030 agenda, the way to essentially clamp down on the freedoms that we've become used to in this country so that they can essentially manipulate and control us even easier. No, you're exactly right. And a lot of this, it goes back to the academic literature and things like political science or international relations, where for a long time it's been recognized that in order to put in some sort of a supernatural or supranational government organization, the main force you have to contend with really is nationalism. And not to say that word gets a bad connotation in the media, but all it means is this identification with the nation state. And so they have to break down the nation state. They're doing it on all fronts. They're doing it on economic, but then you look at immigration, that not only has the economic impact, it has the cultural impact.
Yes.
And in the history, the rewriting of history, and trying to make the younger people feel ashamed of their history. All of this is a breakdown of these national allegiances, which have actually served people relatively well. Yes, there have been massive wars and things, but the truth is that given the limited resources that the world essentially has, these things are somewhat inevitable. And it's been through technology advances, largely driven by the results of those wars, that then we have been able to accommodate the growth in population. And so on an individual level, of course, this nation state situation that we have, it's not perfect. It has issues. As our founding fathers said, the government which governs best is the government that governs least.
Right.
There's no perfect government. It's necessary because men are not angels. But it works. And what they want to replace it with is, as you said, this globalist, which is backed by a very small elite, not even a 1%, a 1% of the 1% that then gets to control everything. And that's the name of that game. And that's what they're trying to put in place. And they're doing it, whether it's, like we said, economic, it's cultural, it's the language, it's the history. And then what they're going to do is they're going to be able to enforce it with the AI, the technology, the invasiveness of, cryptocurrencies, digital tokens, central bank digital currencies or some form thereof, that they'll be bringing out. So it's all part of the plan. It's all happening before our eyes. And there really is kind of like us as a last stand. The United States is kind of the only power large enough, armed well enough in the population to stand up to this. And so that looks like where it's heading. And I just hope that it could be resolved through the ballot box and not have to be resolved otherwise. So we'll see what happens in November. Yes, so there's a lot of great points and a lot of great things in there. But first off, on Russia and Ukraine, yes, the Russian economy is doing well. The ruble, the currency, it fell like a rock in like January of 2023 or right when 22 when the invasion happened. But it's recovered. The Russian stock market has recovered. They've remobilized their entire infrastructure for defense because, when they went in there, I think that there was a mistake that this was going to be rather quick. They weren't surprised that we would be foolish enough to essentially entangle ourselves once again and destroy the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Ukrainians. But what it's really about, to your point, is when you look at the world dispersion of valuable minerals and resources, Ukraine has roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of what the entire United States has. That is one of the world's wealthiest. It's essentially mineral rich, oil and gas rich, amazing farmland. Europe's breadbasket. This is not a random mountainous country like Austria where it's a bunch of Alps. This is grade A productive land. This is land worth trillions with a T, right? And so this is what BlackRock wants to keep. This is why we helped install people like Zelensky, because we wanted people that would cooperate with the West to have this resource grab available for decades or generations to come. And so what Russia really wanted was, essentially to push back on NATO's encroachment. They didn't want weapons coming, just like we didn't want missiles being placed in Cuba. It's actually quite understandable. And now they actually have all the land that they really wanted. They don't want the part of Ukraine that's true Ukrainians. All they wanted was the part of Ukraine that is Russian speaking, ethnically Russian, that borders directly on Russia. That's what they have. And now they're in defensive positions. And these Ukraine incursions or sending missiles into Russia, it's absolute insanity. Putin came out just last week and he gave a statement that from now on, if there are any missiles coming into Ukraine, the Russian use of nuclear weapons is authorized if felt necessary against countries that do so, even if they're not nuclear powers themselves, so long as they're being supplied or aided by a nuclear power. Meaning that if from Finland or an Estonia or one of these countries, we start sending missiles into Russian mainland, that they essentially are telling us, be aware, we reserve the right to use tactical nuclear weapons. So we keep escalating this, and they keep thinking, how can we be so foolish? Do they think that they're not serious? And Putin doesn't bluff. So, we need to start taking this stuff seriously, because it's not just the internal policies, the immigration, the economy that's a disaster. It's the foreign, everything they're doing. It literally, the only way you can explain it is it's a conscious desire to destroy the national state of the United States of America. It's a plan that is being put in progress to systematically, as you said before, the controlled demolition and now the outright demolition of America, so that they can essentially institute this global order that therefore has them sitting at the top with all the power. No, exactly. And when you look at what's happening across Europe that they've been putting in place since the end of World War II, this is actually the enactment of the, as you mentioned, the Bank for International Settlements, some of the top financiers of people that were in the Third Reich that wanted to essentially get rid of the national boundaries, get rid of the trade barriers, have a single currency, which is controlled to this day out of Frankfurt, Germany, the ancestral home of the Rothschild banking family. And so all these plans that were put into place to break down the nation state structure, to take away the ability of Europe to defend itself, turn them into kind of patsy states that can be easily controlled. And then what has happened, I was recently in England for the first time in a while, and it was just shocking walking down the streets of London. I believe it's something like 2% of London's population is now homeless. It's some ridiculous amount. England itself is turning into a third. So that there's a southern, eastern area of England where London is and a couple other major cities. If you exclude that region from the rest of England now, the per capita GDP is something around $20,000 a year. These are GDP levels that are not much different from the third world. England is in a massive state of crisis right now. They have lost their culture. They've lost their. Even the way that things used to operate there. Yeah, it's so obvious, and the stark contrast is just amazing when you walk in the city of London. You walk by the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street. You walk by these massive, gorgeous billion-dollar skyscrapers where, all the big banks have offices. London is still the financial hub of Europe. And then you contrast with that with what's happening on the streets and what's happening in the tube and the subway system there. And then when you get out of London, my understanding is it's just out of control. It's the same thing here. It's the drug addiction. which we haven't even talked about, the way China is essentially feeding it to the terrorist cartel organizations. Right. They're trafficking in women, they're trafficking in children, they're trafficking in fentanyl. It's a breakdown of our country that they're trying to put in place through the open borders, through the debasement of the currency, to the destruction of our culture and history. And, people in Europe are recognizing it. Those parties there are, have their issues, but you're seeing some of these more right-wing parties do well. Some states in Germany a month or two ago had basically their first win in a long time in state legislatures, taking control of them. And the other parties are ganging up on them, and they're not letting them rule, even though they're the party that's getting the most votes. And so we're seeing the steel, the blocks, the block and tackling going on there as well, where the democratic process is not what these people want. Yes, I mean, that's part of it. And JP Morgan too, the largest ETF that tracks gold, GLD, for a long time, all of that gold was held in vaults with HSBC in London and in Switzerland. JP Morgan was brought in to be a custodian, and so they're now holding hundreds of tons of gold that are in their own vaults in New York City. So basically, what I think is actually like a well-known secret by these deep economic state insiders is that the U.S. dollar as this central reserve currency for the world is on its way out the door. And, they're trying to keep the game going as long as possible, drag it out, but they see the writing on the wall. And these BRICS countries, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, you mentioned India, you mentioned China. They have very, very long 1,000-year histories of precious metals as money, just as we did, but they're even deeper and they're still there. In India, for example, over 25,000 tons of gold are owned by the Indian people themselves. So to give you an idea how much gold that is, the United States gold stockpiles owned by the Federal Reserve is 8,000 metric tons of gold. So over 3 times the amount of gold that the United States is owned by the 1+ billion people of India. That's how they store their wealth there. These are unbanked people, many of them. They don't have checking accounts and equity brokerage accounts where they're trading options. They have a silver ring from their grandfather. They have a teapot from their grandmother. They have a gold coin from when gold coins used to be used that's been passed down for generations. And that might be their whole wealth. But when you have 1 billion of these people owning a little bit of gold, a little bit of silver, it's a massive amount. So these countries truly value gold and silver as a store of value. And people know that the new monetary systems that are being put in place by the BRICS countries, they're not going to base them on Bitcoin. That's not their cultural identity. It's probably controlled by the CIA in their minds, and very well may be. So they want gold. That's what they want. And people are realizing it. And what happened was, people in the West have been selling gold. The Bank of England used to hold tons of gold. They sold it all in like the worst possible time in like 2000 for like $200-300 an ounce. They sold thousands of ounces of gold. And so as all of these central banks in the East have been buying gold, as the people there buy gold, the the bankers in the West are finally starting to wake up to this fact, and now gold is attractive to them again. And so now they're trying to get their hands on it. So in the last year or two, it really was mostly these foreign buyers of gold driving the price up. Now we're starting to get the Western players, the Europe banks, the New York banks buying gold as well. And I think literally, I mean, I don't know if we'll see $3,000 an ounce by the end of the year, but I would actually be surprised if we didn't see it by the end of the first quarter. So within the next 6 months. And I think it can go up from there, because it's just showing you it's up like 30%, year to date. The S&P 500 is doing great. It's up 15%, whatever. But when gold's up 30%, how many ounces of gold does it take to buy the S&P 500? It takes a lot less gold to buy the S&P 500 now than it did just a year or two ago. Exactly. And so the stock market continues to go down in gold terms, and yet they keep telling us the economy is so great because it's going up in dollar terms. Well, the dollar is just being debased. These inflation numbers, everybody knows how ridiculous they are. I mean, they are manipulated at every step of the way.
And what happens when the smoke clears, though? No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, one thing about these inflation numbers, like the CPI report, right?
Right.
Trillions of dollars of spending are based on these things, right? The COLA increase for Social Security is based on this number. If they can get it down 0.1% a month or 0.2% of a month, and then you look at compounding and what that's going to do over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, that 0.1% every month, that's saving trillions of dollars from what the government's going to owe in Social Security benefits and other entitlement programs and different things that are tied to this. So those numbers are absolute lies. And the other thing that's happening is I look at, the money supply. I look at the old school way of things, the Mises Institute way of looking at things. And there was a massive spike because of COVID. And then about a year ago, or about a year and a half ago, the money supply actually started declining a little bit. And it was because it had just skyrocketed so much. And about 1 year ago, the money supply started climbing again. Now, what happens is, you usually see inflation on about a 12 to 18th month lag. So it makes total sense that the last 6 months we've seen inflation go down because, as I said, we had this 6-month dip in the money supply about a year, 18 months ago.
Right.
That money supply bottomed in October of 2023. I believe that that this inflation that the Fed is saying they've slayed the dragon and, we're comfortably on our way to the 2% target, that people are going to be shocked in the Q1 of 2025 when instead of seeing inflation heading towards 2%, it's going to be on its way back to 3. And then who knows if it could be back to 4 by the end of the year. Because the other thing that's happening with this China stimulus, just one more thing to add, is that China had been in so much of the doldrums. Now that they're feeding all of this money into the system, that's going to stoke Chinese demand. One of the reasons we also had inflation go down is because Chinese export prices. So you can look at what's the average price paid by wholesalers in the United States for Chinese exports. Those had actually been deflationary during this period, not even disinflation where the inflation was low, but prices have been going down. Those also bottomed about a year ago. So our input costs are going to start going up. The money supply is going up. Meanwhile, the Fed is lowering rates because they know that the U.S. government and commercial real estate firms and BlackRock don't want to have high rates. And so they're lowering rates, thinking that inflation is down or telling us that. And they know full well that it's not. And that's why you see gold go up no matter what. It's like the economy is doing good, gold's going up. The economy is doing bad, it's going up, going down. Whether Kamala wins, Trump wins, it's not going to matter. Gold's going to go up because we are on this path where the dollar just needs to be debased, and that's what they're doing, and they're going to continue to do it. They do that, and especially when prices go up, you do see more shops open up because they take advantage of people where it has $5,000 of melt value and they'll pay you $4,000, right? So they do huge spreads on it. But the thing that the government has always hated about gold is that they don't control it. That you can own the physical gold. And, I'm not advocating this. I would never advocate this. But, you're supposed to pay taxes when you sell it. But it's very difficult. It's not like when you own stocks in a brokerage account, you buy a stock at price X, you sell it at price Z, and then the brokerage firm is required by law to send to you a 1099 saying what you paid for it, how much you made on it, and also to the government. If you buy gold and then you go and sell it, it's impossible. You don't know the tax lot. You don't know when you bought it. This could have been a coin you got from your grandfather. It could have, gold is, and this is the thing that the digital currencies don't have either. The deep secret about things like Bitcoin is that there are huge billion-dollar companies. There's a firm called Chain Analysis. All they do is go into the blockchain of Bitcoin and they look at addresses and they use algorithms and computer programs to figure out who's actually owning these coins. And they can see where these coins are transacting. And then they have contracts with Scotland Yard, with the FBI, so that people can think that they're doing things with Bitcoin and they're anonymous. And so the Bitcoiners, they set up these things that are kind of like washing machines where a bunch of coins get put into it and then they get, mashed around and then distributed. And the government's cracking down really hard on those things. So, when you see people supportive of Bitcoin, as long as they can control some of the infrastructure that could create anonymity by ending these washing machines, then they're fine with Bitcoin because it is trackable and it is knowable, despite what the common perception is. So gold is the only thing that you can have. It doesn't matter what someone inscribes a serial number on a gold bar.
Right.
You can melt that gold bar down and
Right.
and you can craft a new one, and it's 100%. It's an element. You cannot destroy it. It is elemental, and that's the beauty of it. So they truly hate gold. They hate gold. They hate guns. They hate freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's another business that is booming. I have a friend in that business in the Netherlands, so it's happening all over the world.
All over the world, right?
It's not just buying and selling the gold, but also having secure bunkers and depositories in unknown locations. Because obviously, if you have a significant amount of wealth, you don't want it sitting in a safe in your house that someone could come in and threaten to harm you if you don't open the safe or what have you. Nice thing about gold, if it is in a house and it burns, like I said, it's an element. It might melt, but it can be recovered. But you don't want to have that there, and then you don't want to necessarily put it into a safe deposit box at a bank either, because obviously they're under the thumb. So they're building bunkers. They're spending money to own farmland and to do that. And the governments are doing the same things, right? And what the machine wants is just people to be stupid, people to be in debt, people to spend money on consumer items that they don't need, and listen to the propaganda, and then they can keep them on the treadmill. And it's very hard to get off. Believe me, I understand, especially if maybe you didn't wake up to some of these things until later in life, and then all of a sudden you had 200,000 in student loan and 30,000 in credit card, and you're like, that sounds great, Mel. How do I get out of this cycle? And that could be a whole other show. But it's a tough situation, and people are trying their best, and that's the way that. That's the reason why the polls are so close, because there are people that are so caught up in their day-to-day life. They just don't have the time. They don't have the luxury that people like you and me can have to go to a BIS website and read what's happening.
The luxury.
And that's why it's so wonderful, to distill it in a program like yours, and people can watch it for 45 minutes, and they can get a lowdown of all of the work that we're doing throughout the week, and pass it on, because you're just not going to get it from NBC or Fox or any of the major corporations.
Very sad.
Yeah, well, one thing you do have to do sometimes is get outside and clear your head from the barrage, because at least there you can get a sense that at least the sky is not falling yet in a literal sense. Although it certainly seemed like it to some of the people in Western North Carolina this week. Yep. But I do think from a financial perspective, so I think with this election, there's a very high probability that it could be so close, one way or another, that we have an extended dragged out period. And I think that would be detrimental for the stock markets. And so just actually today, because we had such a nice run up after Powell and so on, I did sell, because I do own equities. I own a lot of gold. I own land. I own rental homes. That's where most of my wealth is. But I do still invest in the stock market, because I believe that through the debasement of the dollar, ultimately earnings go up. And that's why I never come on your show predict an imminent collapse of the stock market. I think it's going to happen eventually, but not this year, not even next year. I think they're blowing up a stock market bubble. And so I'm trying to take advantage of that when I can. In the short term, I think that if don't be greedy. If you've got some really nice things that you don't have, maybe large short-term taxable gains that you have to pay, it's not a bad time to lighten up and see what happens in the next 6 weeks. Because if we have tensions explode a little bit more in the Middle East, if we have a long disputed election, it wouldn't be out of the realm possibility to me to see a sell-off in October and maybe the first part of November, and then see us come roaring back to the end of the year to close out the year at new highs. And so I'm buying a little protection. I buy some puts on the S&P 500 today, just some things to kind of protect some money, take some gains. So that's some practical financial advice for people. Not advice. I don't want to say it's advice. That's what I'm doing.
No, you're doing. Yeah.
Heading as we head into the end of the year here. And then the other thing, praying, getting out into nature, and just trying to also remember, there's a lot of people that see things kind of clearly and understand what's going on. And, I don't think they're going to get away with it. It's going to be a battle. People are fighting. People are standing up. People are starting to wake up all around the world to the propaganda. You're seeing, Gen Zers not buying into it. You're seeing people in Europe. You're seeing people start to recognize what's happening, and they're, even if they don't understand it intellectually, they understand it instinctually that this is just not right, and they're revolting against it.